Michael Elliot frowned at the letter which had come from the honorary curator of the local museum. It was quite a short letter and quite a simple one, merely asking if he would allow the museum to borrow his witch's bone for a special exhibition covering folk beliefs and customs. But Michael Elliot found the letter far from welcome. Short and simple as it was, it revived and increased all the fearful troubles of his mind. More than that, dare he now let the bone pass out of his own keeping, even if only for a little while? Every day, for the last week, that witch's bone had preoccupied his mind to the exclusion of all else. The witch's bone that had brought to an end all his quarrels with Mackenzie Grant. The witch's bone that had possibly given him a revenge far more terrible than anything he had sought or expected. In a fit of anger, he had thought of only testing its efficacy, never really believing that it would work. And now he knew that the bone had worked only too well. Or had it? Had he indeed compassed Grant's death? All he knew was that Grant had died, and that now he found it hard to recover his peace of mind. Of course, he had only himself to blame. He had shown the bone at the last meeting of their local antiquarium society, just after he had acquired it, and pleased with himself, had expatiated upon its awful power. Mackenzie Grant had contradicted him, as usual. Grant had always treated his theories with contempt. There was his paper on lake dwellings, and after that, his paper on the Iron Age forts in the Central Highlands. Upon both occasions, Grant had stood up and pooh-poohed everything he had said. At meetings of the council, too, the man could be relied upon to speak against anything proposed. But all that was past history. Grant had poured scorn upon his story of the bone, and now Grant was dead. Yet how unbounded would be the relief of his tortured mind if Grant had been right, and if the story of the bone were stuff of nonsense, and nothing more. The very night that Grant had ridiculed his story, he had put the bone to the test, directing its malevolent powers against Mackenzie Grant, and Grant had died a horrible death a few hours later. But could it not have been a ghastly coincidence in which the bone had played no part at all? It was only a short piece of bone, probably sheep bone, about 6 inches long, with a narrow ring of black bog oak tightly encircling it near its centre. He had acquired it during his recent holiday in Sutherland. An old woman had died in a remote glen, and because she had been reputed to be a witch, and had been feared as such, no one would bear her to burial. The local minister had called upon him, beseeching his help. The poor body was no witch at all, the minister had said. She was just old and ill-favoured. I've had a coffin made about the right size, at any rate it will be large enough, and if you could just drive me to the old body's hut, with the coffin in the rear of your estate wagon, maybe we could manage to coffin her and give her a Christian burial. A strange request to make of any man, but the minister had won him over, and his reward had been the witch's bone. They had found it on a shelf in the old woman's hut. The minister had seen it first, and had prodded it gently with his finger. "So," he said softly, "the witch's bone. I have been told of it. There are those of my people who say that she would utter her curse upon some man or woman, and they would make a wax figure and stick a pin into it. They say that if this bone rattled on its shelf, she knew that her curse had taken effect, and that the person portrayed in the wax would be seized with pains in that part of the body which corresponded with the place of the pin in the wax. Some even said that she could kill by sticking the pin in the heart or the head. For the power is in the bone. It can wound or kill any who are cursed by its possessor, and never are they spared." He had listened and looked with astonishment until suddenly the minister's face had changed, and he cried out, "But what am I saying to you? There is no witch of Endor in Sutherland. Indeed there is not. No such devilry is possible. I am not believing one word of it." And the minister had boldly picked up the bone and offered it to him. "Take it with you," he said. "It may interest some of your friends in the south." And, wondering, he had taken it. Yes, it had interested some of his friends, but Mackenzie Grant had laughed at him. "A witch's bone," he had said contemptuously. "Stuff of nonsense. Anyone can see by just looking at it that it's a handle and nothing more. That ring round its centre simply means that when it's grasped, 2 fingers go on one side of the ring and 2 fingers on the other. Any boy flying a kite grasps a piece of wood in exactly the same way at the end of his string. A witch's bone indeed. I believe, Elliot, I could persuade you that a handkerchief with a hole in it is a witch's veil to be worn at meetings of her coven, and the hole, of course, would be symbolic, indicative of her lapse from the Christian faith. And so the man had gone on, laughing at him before his friends. He had kept down his anger which surged within him, but when he returned home and had taken the bone from his pocket, all of his pent-up feelings had broken their bounds. He had marched straight into his study and, placing the bone upon a bookshelf near the fireplace, had resolved to prove its power to hurt. Aloud and deliberately, he had cursed Mackenzie Grant, but searching for sealing wax, could find none. Then he had recalled the photograph of Mackenzie Grant in a recent volume of the Transactions of their Society. He had recalled, too, this aversion to destroying any photograph. To tear up a photograph had always seemed to him to be akin to tearing the living flesh and bones. So much better. Mackenzie Grant should be torn asunder with a vengeance. He had ripped the full-page photograph from the book and had deliberately torn it to pieces. In the fury of his task, he had for a moment forgotten the bone. But as the torn pieces had multiplied between his hands, suddenly there had come a rattling sound from the nearby shelf. And at that, his heart had turned to ice. Fearfully he had looked at the bone, but it lay exactly where he had placed it, and it lay inert and still. He remembered assuring himself that he had simply imagined that rattle. He was overwrought. Yes, it was imagination, and nothing more. Yet, the next morning, when reading the Scotsman at breakfast time, again a chill had struck his heart, and his whole body had numbed with fear. For the paper announced, with regret, that a distinguished antiquary, Mr. Mackenzie Grant, had been killed in a road accident. According to the announcement, Mr. Grant, when driving home about midnight, after having dined with a friend, had unaccountably run head-on into a heavy lorry that had stopped for some minor adjustment on the opposite side of the road. It was a bad accident. Grant's car had been completely telescoped. But in the opinion of the doctors, he must have been killed instantaneously, for their examination showed that he had suffered multiple injuries and that practically every bone in his body was broken. No wonder his mind was ill at ease. He had striven to persuade himself that it was pure coincidence, that those multiple injuries had naught to do with a photograph torn into many shreds. He had laboured to free himself from a haunting burden of guilt, yet the torturing thought was still there. Had the bone indeed the power of killing those who were cursed by its possessor? Since then he had locked it up in his coin cabinet. He had even been afraid to open the cabinet to make certain it was still there. And now the museum had asked to be allowed to borrow it, to put it on display. To say he had lost it, or had destroyed it, would be childish. Yet dare he lend it? Dare he allow it to pass out of his own keeping? These were but some of the thoughts that troubled the mind of Dr. Michael Elliot as he sat with a letter that lay before him on his desk.